dogma lesson just not bothering to plan? That's a question for TEFLologists. When I read this book, is it better to skim or scan? That's a question for TEFLologists. Can you be a good teacher if you have a CELTA? Or should you invest in an MA or a Delta? From politics to methodology, we'll discuss them all on TEFLology.
Hi, I'm Matthew.
I'm Rob.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome back to the TEFLology podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters. This is the second of our JALT 2015 special episodes. Today's episode is a little different. We're going to be playing the audio from a presentation we gave at the JALT conference all about this podcast. It was called Teachers Learning Through Podcasting, a Narrative. It wasn't a narrative, unfortunately, but you'll be able to hear that later.
So, first of all, before we get to that, how was the conference for you?
It was fun, yeah. It's I can't remember, fourth JALT I've been to in a row. And it's, as everybody knows who goes to these conferences, it's kind of a mixed bag. Yeah. You see some good stuff, you see some bad stuff. The bad stuff is kind of depressing, I find. But I don't know, at this point I go mainly to meet up with people who I don't see that often. Like my old MA peers and people I used to work with. I like that side of it. Yeah, I think that's kind of why everyone goes to That's why no one comes to the presentations unless it's their friends presenting.
For me, I enjoyed the venue. That's a really important thing when going to conferences. The venue was good. The extras, the food, the drink.
And the people who were paid to walk around in the background to make it look full. Those extra.
Yeah. So maybe we should explain. It was in Shizuoka City, which is a pretty small city in Japan.
Yeah, it was a nice place for it to be, though. I think nicer than it wasn't in the middle of a massive city like it has been in the past.
Yeah, it was close to the station. You could see Mount Fuji from the conference.
Great view.
Venue. It was amazing. Yeah.
So it's kind of between Tokyo and Osaka, I guess.
We should say JALT is one of the, if not the biggest teacher conference in Japan. No, sorry.
In Japan,
definitely in Japan. In Asia.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So I mean, personally, I haven't been to any other conferences in Asia, so I don't know how they compare. But
it depends how you define Asia. If you're including India, I'm guessing that there's big conferences there as well. But certainly, I think in the sort of Asia Pacific region, very specifically, it's the biggest one. But I agree. I thought the venue was really good.
Nice,
a couple of years ago, it was split between two buildings across a road, so people just had to keep crossing the road back and forth. But this time, it was in a big sort of futuristic spaceship building.
Yeah, it's very centralised. And did you see any interesting presentations?
That's a good question. I mostly saw friends of mine presenting, and so and it's you don't want to judge them too much. Right. But I mean, all the ones I saw, I enjoyed. Often it was because it was something I was interested, a topic I was interested in. Yeah. Or for example, people who were on the same MA course as I was. Doing kind of similar research to the kind of stuff I did, so it was good to see what they were doing. Yeah,
I've heard two different schools of thought about the JALT conference, or maybe about just the JALT conference. Someone said that they said there was too much research. Okay. And they wanted to go there for practical ideas, and they said it was too data heavy. Whereas I've heard the other side saying it wasn't enough of that. And there were just people going in there with ideas. Right. They were saying, this is my own idea, but every other conference around the world has had using smartphones to increase motivation.
I think there's so many presentations. I mean, at any given time, there's probably 10 going on.
Yeah, it's like Glastonbury, trying to go through all the stages.
And so whatever you go to, you're getting a very narrow view of what's there. So I think it's hard to kind of find an overall trend.
Yeah, and I found that a lot of the things that I wanted to see were either on at the same time as us or at the same time as the plenaries, and the plenaries just suck everyone into the main rooms away from those little presentations.
There were some really busy rooms. I went to one by Paul Nation, who we previously interviewed, and there were people standing, people in the aisles, people standing.
Trying to leave.
No, not many people, not many walkouts, but there was hundreds of people in this little room, and they just didn't budget for that, basically.
Yeah. Well, I think they save the big rooms for the sort of the JALT sponsored plenaries, and if they get someone, even if it's a big name who wasn't brought over by the conference specifically, they're not going to get special treatment, which is kind of fair in a way, but yeah.
Maybe we'll use a future episode to talk about English teaching conferences. I don't think we've covered that.
That'd be good. A conference special about conferences.
Yeah. But for the time being, here's our presentation from JALT 2015. Welcome to our presentation today. First of all, the title of our presentation, Teachers Learning Through Podcasting, a Narrative. And we're going to use the word narrative in a quite loose term, but we hope to kind of give you the story of what our podcast was and what it is now and what it means for us as well as teachers. Maybe we should begin by just introducing ourselves. So,
hi, I'm Matthew.
I'm Rob.
And I'm Matt. Okay. And if you've listened to our podcast before, can I have a show of hands? Who's actually listened? Smuttering. Okay, that's fine. That's usually how we introduce ourselves on the actual show. Okay, so just to give you a bit of context there. We're all English teachers ourselves. We're all practicing teachers, and the podcast itself was a kind of a way of professional development for us, which we'll go into a bit later on. Here's our logo for the podcast, the TEFLology podcast. We don't mean this to be a way of promoting it today. We don't want our presentation today as a sales pitch, but that's what it is. That's our logo. I should just say our podcast itself is an independent podcast made by us. It's released fortnightly, although that kind of differs, or it has kind of slightly changed over time. And the podcast itself contains discussions and interviews about TEFL and all TEFL-related things. We were considering the theme of the conference, and a lot of the time people kind of neglect the actual theme of the conference, but we actually considered what it might mean for us as learners. And we had a lot of takes on this. We were kind of worried at first because our podcast isn't actually for learners, or the conventional learners. So we were thinking, well, how does this apply to us? Learning to be podcasters, learning more from the field, learning about and from each other, learning from feedback from listeners, learning about and from the online teaching community. And by that we mean bloggers, people on Twitter. Learning about being providers, actually providing content. This was something that we'd never had in this kind of way before. And also learning about professional development. And as we're going to talk about today, we feel that this podcast for us is a form of professional development / therapy for us, perhaps. And we had a nice quote from somebody on Twitter who actually kind of tweeted us, there is much to learn from each other in our community. So we felt this kind of summed up what we want to talk about today.
So in terms of professional development, we see the podcast as a form of continuing professional development for ourselves, but also contributing to the professional development of other teachers, people who listen to it, some of the people who are on courses where it's been added to reading lists and that kind of thing, which has happened. So continuing professional development can be defined as any professional development activities engaged in by teachers which enhance their knowledge and skills and enable them to consider their attitudes and approaches with the view to improve the quality of the teaching and learning process. I just read that. So that's the definition of continuing professional development that we're using. And recently there's been a lot of focus on blogs, media, Twitter, that kind of thing, social networking, as forms of CPD. Now, the podcast doesn't really fit neatly into any of those categories. It's not like a blog, because a blog is, kind of drafted and redrafted, and the way that people engage with blogs is kind of staggered over time. So people write comments maybe days or even weeks later. It's not immediate. So there's a lot of time to think about what people are writing and what people are saying. And as you can see, blogs have been investigated as ways for teachers to reflect on their work individually, but also as part of a community of practice, going back and forth. The podcast is kind of similar to that, but it's unique in that the way that we learn from each other is immediate. So when you listen to the podcast, you're listening to the process of us learning from each other. Usually only one person has researched a topic and the other two don't know anything about it. So when you hear us asking questions, those are real questions. And the title of the presentation says that we're doing a narrative. Narrative inquiry brings storytelling and research together, either by using stories as data or by using storytelling as a tool for data analysis. And another quote, in order to recognise and document the activity of teacher learning and language teaching through the perspective of teachers, it's necessary to gather descriptive accounts of how teachers come to know their knowledge. And I think this is a key point, because the podcast is an account of how teachers come to know their knowledge, us as teachers coming to know things about the field, and as I said, it's immediate. What you're hearing is us learning. It's a very immediate record of that. So in the presentation, we're going to describe our experiences of professional development. We'll play some clips from the podcast, and we'll show how our experience of making the podcast has influenced our professional development and our knowledge as teachers.
Okay, so I'd like to talk a little bit about why we started this podcast in the first place. Basically, the three of us, we were colleagues, but also friends, so we would obviously go for drinks after work occasionally, and try to forget about work and talk about other things, but it very often happened that we came back to talking about TEFL-related things. So we decided we should do something with these conversations we're having. We also thought it's a way to keep us motivated in the profession. Depending on your teaching context, you may be teaching one particular skill, and so just to keep motivated, keep coming to things like JALT is part of it. But this is kind of forcing us to do every 2 weeks, as we said, thinking about TEFL on a wider field, just outside of our own teaching context. We're all fans of podcasts. We all listen, or the three of us all listen to a lot of podcasts, and so I guess we reached a point where we listened to enough of them that we felt we knew the format quite well. We knew what might make a podcast interesting. And yeah, the last point, bringing podcasting to the ELT profession. I'll talk a little bit later or soon about there are other ELT podcasts out there. Podcasts not for learners, but for teachers. But when we started our podcast, it was kind of, well, I'll talk about it a little bit later, but there was a little bit of a gap in the market at that time. So yeah, language learning podcasts. As I said, if you go to iTunes or wherever you find your podcasts and you search English language, you'll find probably hundreds, literally hundreds of podcasts which are designed for English language learners. And there's plenty for Japanese language learners and every language you can imagine. And some of these are very good, some of these are not so good, but there's a lot for learners. But what we noticed was there weren't many for teachers. So that's something that we decided to again, fill the gap in the market. So this is a list of some TEFL podcasts for teachers. None of these are still going. So they usually ran for a year or a couple of years. The last two they may still be going, I'm not sure. But long hiatus. And this is, I don't know how familiar you are with the general world of podcasting, but it's a very common phenomenon that podcasts will start up and, for whatever reason, burn out.
You probably add us to this list in 2 years.
Okay. However, there is one podcast which started a while ago, The Lives of Teachers, which is excellent, and that's still going. And that's exclusively interviews with people in the field. It's audio and also video, and that's one I can very highly recommend. Since we started our podcast in, late spring 2014, 3 new ones have come about: Masters of TESOL, the TEFL Commute podcast, and EFL Magazine podcast. And I'm not saying anything because I don't think they're good, I just haven't listened to them. So, Rob talked a little bit about it, this idea of TEFL blogs and Twitter accounts, and how we see ourselves kind of in that world. Podcasts are certainly part of this exploding, online presence of teachers, and we're very happy to be part of that. And We have a Twitter account, and we do get into dialogue with listeners through the Twitter account.
Yeah, we should just say as well, like 2014 has kind of been described by some people as kind of the renaissance year of the podcast in ELT. Very, very sensitive. But yeah, this obviously there's been, like as Matt said, a kind of a boom in the number of podcasts. And there's been a recent article by Sean Wilden, written in the Modern English Teacher, is that correct?
Yeah.
About podcasting. So it is kind of making its way into the centre a little bit more, and people are starting to know about it more. What our podcast is in particular, it's a form of open access material. For example, interviews. We have interviews with famous TEFLers, I guess, kind of celebrities in a sense. But it's open access, like that data is free for anyone to download. There's no kind of limits or walls or payment there. Also for us, it's non-commercial, it's voluntary, and it's a hobby-like venture, as Rob kind of described earlier on. There's always misconceptions about what our podcast is when we're speaking to other people. We're not offering language tuition or advice to learners, probably or teachers as well, we could add to that. It's not restricted, as I just said before, and we're not sponsored or externally subsidised in any way. And if you've listened to our podcast, we cover lots of different topics, but it's generally split into news, TEFL cultures, and TEFL pioneers. In the pioneers section, we focus on historical figures that may or may not be that well known, even to us. So as Rob said earlier, we're finding out live. TEFL news, we try and keep up to date with what's going on, and now that we've joined Twitter, fairly recently, not at the start, but we've now joined Twitter, we're getting all this news as it happens, and we can kind of choose what we want to talk about more. And finally, TEFL cultures, and this kind of started off as us looking at methodologies, but we started going more kind of minute, kind of looking at particular points rather than the Richards and Rogers book, which I think we were trying to get through at one point, but we're kind of going a bit more minute now.
We'll play some examples of these later on to illustrate a point, so you'll get a chance to hear.
And of course, by researching this, we're actually conducting mini research projects on a deadline, often right up to the beginning of the show. But the topics rotate week by week. We usually do weekly recordings, so we usually come together and record them week by week, but they go out fortnightly, as we said. And yeah, we have these research projects just to facilitate our discussion. When we first started the podcast, we went in without any pre-researched ideas and just tried to speak, and we found that was quite difficult to do. So we decided to actually make kind of short kind of presentations, actually type them up, get our notes ready. So we feel this in itself is a discipline that we've learnt, which we'll talk about later.
So, how has the podcast influenced our teaching? Well, in terms of our teaching, in terms of our classroom practice, it's given us exposure to new ideas about methods. So as Matt said, for a while we were trying to get through the Richards and Rogers book. And for me, I learned a lot about those methods. I'd kind of heard about them a little bit, but I didn't know what they were. And there are some ideas from those, even from some stupid things like Suggestipedia, which is ridiculous. But even from that, there are some ideas that I've managed to take and incorporate into the classroom. Also, new activity ideas. So in one episode, Matt did a whole section about dictogloss, which again I'd heard about, but I'd never actually used. So that was a good opportunity for me to learn about something and then try and use it later on in the classroom. And I wouldn't have heard about that if he hadn't just chosen that topic to research. Shared teaching experiences. Often during the podcast, we use our own experiences in the classroom to support points or to stimulate discussion. And that's a really good opportunity to hear about what the other members of the TEFLology team are getting up to in their professional lives. And then, again, kind of from the same point, new perspectives on the classroom. So we hear a lot about what's happening in other people's classrooms. We sometimes have guests on the show as well who give their perspectives. And it's very interesting to hear what other people are doing, because teaching can often be kind of a solitary venture. Unless you come to JALT, you meet all these people. So those are some of the ways that it's influenced our teaching.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about how it's influenced our research. So as researchers outside of the podcast, what happens, as I'm sure all of you know, is that we get very focused on one topic for a long period of time, which is great, and we explore that topic very deeply. But you are on that one issue for a long time. What the podcast does is kind of the opposite. We look at not so deeply, but over a shorter period of time, just one little topic, which means over that long period of time, we research lots of different things. Again, not as deeply, but it is a nice change of pace for the type of research we usually do. It also pushes us to look beyond our immediate interests. So having to find new pioneers, find new cultures every 2 weeks, basically, pushes us to look outside our usual area of interest, which is, I think, always a good thing. And then preparing for the interviews makes us read books that we might not normally read, books by the people that we're going to interview, and again, just being amazed at the kind of things that we find by reading things that we wouldn't normally read.
Again, we'll play a clip of an interview later on as well. And how's it helped us professionally? So, I mean, professionally is kind of a big category, but for me personally, it's given me a much broader knowledge of the field of ELT, and I think it's the same for you guys. And it's put us in touch with big names in the field. So when we started doing the podcast, we just emailed people on the off chance they might like to speak with us. But it's been very surprising how often, and how often people have replied positively, and how willing people have been to speak to us. We've had a chance to speak to people like, Henry Widowson and Rod Ellis and Claire Cramch, and all these people who, otherwise we would never have had a chance to speak to, because we are like ants to them.
Maybe we should say on the flip side to that, we have had rejection as well. We have had, as I said earlier, feedback. We have had constructive feedback, not so constructive feedback. We've had a couple of angry emails, not angry emails, but emails that were very biased to one particular opinion. And yeah, so that's also for us a learning curve as well, like taking on board these kind of uncertainties about the ELT podcast and what it means for people. And even some of the big names, for example, are a bit sceptical of that as well.
Mm-hmm. And the final point is that it's made us more reflective. Because, again, you have a classroom experience. I think this is probably true for blogs as well, or for any kind of engagement with the profession. But if you know you're going to be talking about something, you tend to notice things more in the classroom. You tend to notice things more about your teaching. And then when you're discussing things with your colleagues, it brings up incidents that maybe you'd forgotten about, but they take on a new significance because you discuss them in a context of a particular topic.
Okay, so how has the podcast increased our knowledge of the field? So these are the four kind of topics that we cover. History, usually always in the form of a TEFL pioneer. But what's great about looking at the TEFL pioneers is it's basically pushed us to go back and look at the history of TEFL. And we do that through looking at the lives of these important figures along the way. Different teaching methods, the news, and learning through the interview.
Okay. So that's us. I think we've got a couple of minutes for questions. Okay, but yeah, thank you for coming today. And if you feel like listening to it, go ahead. But you don't have to. But we just hope today we've kind of given you kind of our story up to now, and we're actually hoping to make a more formal inquiry into what motivates podcasters and bloggers into leading this or going into this kind of professional development. So that might be a follow-up presentation soon. But thank you very much. Thank you. We've got a couple of minutes for questions, maybe, if you have any.
The first question we received was about where we record the podcast.
It's usually an empty classroom.
Yeah, we have a snowball mic, which we bought for the podcast, and it's pretty good. Yeah.
The second question was about how we include the podcast in our resumes and what our non-podcasting colleagues think about it.
I think it's gone two ways. Like, I think some people are, I want to say, put off by it, or so. I mean, with doing a podcast, it's for a niche audience anyway, and even like ELT teachers probably don't have time or the interest to actually listen to a podcast about teaching. So I feel that some of our co-workers, even though they're very motivated individuals, they're not interested in hearing more about teaching when they go home, for example. So that's one kind of feeling we've had. The other is very supportive, and people buy into it and enjoy it and follow it up with us. Putting it into resumes, I'm not quite sure how it fits yet. I haven't really, it's not a neat fit.
I'm the only one who's made a resume since we started the podcast. So yeah, what I did was I put it as like a non-academic online publication. In that sort of slot. But people tend to be, my bosses, my co-workers, tend to be quite impressed that we're making the effort to do this. And even if they don't listen to it themselves, I think any engagement with the field, and especially kind of innovative engagement, is seen as a positive point. Yeah.
One audience member asked if we would consider interviewing up-and-coming teachers as well as the big names in our interview episodes.
Yes, yeah, we have interviewed some people like that. We also have teachers occasionally guesting as a guest TEFLologist, which is what we self-certified as.
For example, we had Anna on talking about blogging. Sorry, sir. Yeah.
Yeah, so we do that, but the big names get more downloads. So.
And not always necessarily big names. We had, I don't know if you know Jeff Jordan, who's a blogger, right? I think he has written a book. He's not obviously a Rod Ellis but he's a very interesting speaker and very interesting views, and that was one of our big downloads. Yeah.
The next question was about audience participation and engagement with the podcast.
Well, we do like if people contact us on Twitter and ask us to talk about something, then we will talk about that. And some people email us as well with suggestions, but that is something that we're actually trying to improve. So we're planning to make a Facebook page and a website where people can contact us more easily. So yeah, I think that's an issue that we're trying to work on.
Yeah, just yesterday you guys interviewed Joan Kang-Shin yesterday, and we got some suggestions for questions on Twitter. Actually, just one suggestion, but we put that into the interview itself. So, I mean, that's one way that we bring the audience. We also had the idea of actually podcasting at conferences, actually doing like a live audience interview, kind of, not with us, but with the actual presenters, or anyone here, I guess, but that was met with some hostility, perhaps? I'm not sure, but yeah.
From the JALT people?
I don't understand.
Sorry.
One audience member wanted to know how we're affected by critical or negative feedback.
We cry for a day, and then shake it off, and we're fine.
Someone wrote on Twitter, TEFLology, with the lol emphasized.
Yeah. We obviously respond. We've gotten a few emails with mix of positive and negative, or mostly negative, and we respond to those, and we try to use it all as constructive criticism. Yeah.
The next question was about our audience demographics.
One way we get it is from where they say they're from in the emails. That's one way. From who follows us on Twitter, we can kind of guess where they're coming from. The only other analytics we have are the actual downloads numbers, but that's not non-country.
No, to get that kind of information from the service, the hosting service, you have to pay more. So we don't have that at the moment, but it would be really interesting.
Okay, so we'll end there. But yeah, thanks a lot for coming today. Thank you. Thank you for listening to today's episode, and also thanks to those who attended. Some of our listeners were actually in the audience, so it was great to finally meet you.
As usual, if you'd like to get in contact with us, you can send an email to teflology@gmail.com, or you can follow us on Twitter @teflology. Also, if you could spare the time to write a review or give a rating on iTunes, or just tell your friends about the podcast, it would be a big help for us. This is Rob interjecting from the future just to add that we actually do now have a Facebook page, which we mentioned in the presentation. So if you'd like to discuss this episode or any of the other episodes, just search for the TEFLology podcast on Facebook and join in the discussion there. So, it's goodbye from me.
It's goodbye from me.
Goodbye.